All right, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Cooperman, president of Scoop Cyber. Just quickly, we're a value-added reseller that focuses on emerging and disruptive cyber solutions. Super excited about the topic today. Obviously the threat landscape is ever increasing from all aspects. As of today, we see what's going on in the world in the Middle East with Iran, the trifecta of other countries that are adversaries of the U.S. So not only is it the traditional cyber threats, but increasing insider threat from all different aspects, internal, external, nation actors. So we're going to talk today with an expert who I'll introduce in a minute about that and some of the things you need to think about. And more importantly, we're going to drill down on the threat from North Korea. But, that transcends to other nation states as well. So we'll talk about how their tactics and operations and organization go after insider threat. And we're going to talk about how solutions could help manage that, mitigate that, and reduce the risk of insider threat. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce my guest today, Rob Shewitt, Director of Insider Intelligence and Investigations at DTEX. Rob has an impressive career in cyber and expertise in insider threat, supports many organizations around the world, and is definitely going to give some tremendous insights of this problem and that everybody should be thinking about. So I think everybody's going to enjoy it. Also, rather than a traditional webinar, this is podcast style. We're here at Carasoft in their studio. So thank you to Carasoft for hosting and everybody this, kind of new format that we're doing. I think you're going to find a lot more intriguing and beneficial. So, Rob, before we get going, I think people know about insider threat, but, how do you define it in the broader context? So everybody could level set of, what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And yeah, this important topic, I do want to cover the basics and, how do we define insider risk, right? So this is anybody or an element at your organization that is looking to cause harm or either through purpose or accidentally, and it will take away the value or the security of working at that organization and the safety. Anything that is going to cause that you wouldn't feel good about working there, you wouldn't feel good about protecting and contributing to the intellectual property and the mission of that company, the insider risk can take away from that. So it can come in many different formats, but the typical ways we define insider risk and insider threat are those people or things that would cause harm to your company for different intents and purposes, malicious and unintentional.
So we're going to dive into this, as I mentioned, a little bit more later. But, of all the threat vectors of insider threat, what do you think is the biggest problem or the biggest issue?
Yeah, right now, the biggest problem in insider threat is definitely, in my opinion, is the departing employees and the DPRK, or the North Korean, Democratic People of North Korea. They have an insider threat campaign built by design to using IT workers or remote workers taking jobs under false identities and stealing those pay packets from otherwise legitimate employees and doing work for these companies under false pretenses. That leads to a lot of vulnerabilities. That leads to vulnerabilities in the network, into your what you're giving them access to, and of course that money that is being paid to them through this, we'll do air quotes, legitimate work. That money is going back to fund a evil power in North Korea. So being able to get onto your network, use your resources, and to be able to, place themselves wherever they need to be in order to fund themselves, it can have devastating consequences to organizations not knowing that this is going on and not being able to get them out. It's tough to detect. They're doing their job that they're hired for.
Yeah, it's amazing, and the sophistication is only increasing. I'm not sure, every organization, small agency, state and local, is thinking about that. In addition to that, what effect do you think the work at home from COVID, which is existing, and Doge, putting a lot of talented people on the street, as well as maybe some disgruntled employees as a result of that? You think there's an impact of that as well?
Absolutely. When, COVID hit us all and the pandemic shut us down and we had to continue working in some way, it expanded the remote worker element. Well, along with all things that help us succeed, well, then come along the bad guys that want to take advantage of that opportunity. And that spawned the overemployment community. And by the overemployment community, what I'm meaning is these are individuals that decided that they're not just going to take their time and work for one company legitimately. They're going to take advantage of the not being monitored, not having to report into an office opportunity, being a full-time remote employee, and then take another job as a full-time remote employee. Depending on your morals and ethics, I'm not the moral police. I always said that as an FBI agent, but, a crime is a crime. And when they are taking several pay packets home with them, and several layers of benefits, that's hurting somebody that otherwise legitimately needed that job or could work that job. Now, work that into the people that say, well, actually, I'm going to take that job, and now I'm going to go and find a contractor for that job in, say, India or another foreign country without vetting that person at all. But they sell that job, essentially, the work that they're doing for that job. They sell it over to this contractor to get this website built, to write this code, to do whatever the job they were hired for to do, and then they're going to pay a fraction of that money over to that contractor, but submit it as themselves. Highly unethical, and they're doing this, and the company expects that this is the person that they hired, that they vetted. But now they've lost control of that because there's this third-party contractor now doing the work that they have no idea who this is, and that person could, put in back doors, could do faulty work, and then the person that hired them to do that is going to have to answer that if they get caught. So it can be devastating. Well, now you take the North Koreans that decided, hey, we can actually apply for these jobs. Well, but you can't hire a North Korean worker, so they have to get a stolen identity. They have to get a facilitator, somebody in some way to be able to pass the employment verification stage and get through the interview process to get these jobs. Well, then the North Koreans will stack, 7, 8, 9, 10 people in one small place, and they'll just do these works from their laptops. They'll work and make this money, but they only get to keep like 20% by our estimates at DTEX. We think that they are getting 20% of that income, keeping it for themselves, and then 80% of it goes straight back to North Korea. So if you're making $120,000 a year in this job that you took, and $100,000 of it per person is going back to North Korea, the math on that is pretty staggering about how much money they're making per year, per person, for funding their, nuclear weapons program and the sustainment of North Korea. So this overemployment piece has given them an opportunity to get in, be a virtual or remote worker, and conduct any type of evil that they want to. But right now, they're happy just taking the money. They're getting paid, they're getting a salary, and they're able to farm this out. And each one of these workers, by the way, they have 2 to 3 to 4 of these jobs at a time. So it's a massive amount of work and a massive amount of money, but they're only getting a small portion of it.
So do you think organizations are ready for that? Is that something they could do manually, or they would just be left undetected? And then, how does DTEX think about that? And we'll talk more about the DTEX platform and some of the capabilities. But how would, a dedicated, focused platform on insider threat help an organization address this? How would you find that this was going on, at least notionally or exact names?
Yeah, this is a new problem, and it's a very complex problem. Most companies were starting to get a handle on how to do some sort of check-ins and monitoring on their remote workforce. Whether it be looking for mouse movements or just time logged in versus time logged out, typical things. But most companies trust their employees to do the right thing and to put in a good day of work. So the surveillance on that was pretty light. However, there were, again, people abusing this freedom and were putting on mouse jigglers and other things to make it look that, mouse movers and just other tools to keep their systems not logged in and make it look like you were doing mouse movements, although no work was happening and you weren't there. And then along with, of course, hiring third-party people to do it. Those were things that were hard to detect. So as the bar has been raised to protect your organization, some of the things that companies need to start doing is looking at other types of protective factors, such as, when they log into a meeting, are they behaving like a normal person would? Do they come off mic? Do they go on camera? Do they have some sort of verbal parole? As hey, how was your weekend? Or do you have any vacation plans? Things that are human being type of aspects that we call protective factors. We've noticed that people that are misusing this freedom, or the DPRK IT workers, they can't do that. They don't know how, or they're not in a position to be able to do it, and their accents, their English language is very poor. So there are some things that they just can't do because it will, cause them to be discovered as a fraudulent worker. So a lot of these human resources groups and recruiting groups, they're playing catch up to this. It's a new thing, and we've been trying to get the evangelism out at DTEX, other organizations. The FBI has put out products. They've done arrests and indictments. There's many ways to see what's going on, but that's all, right of boom, right? We don't want to be there because that means the worker's been there, the fraud has happened, evil has occurred. We want to get left of boom, and that's to not hire them in the first place and be able to detect these people. So while they're on the network, the detections such as our software as a service that DTEX has, we have a behavioral-based approach, and that's truly the best way to look at this, is going behavioral-based, stacking up these types of activities, which, in our approach, it's a A plus B plus C equals Z, and we figure out, how to get to that worker based upon those additional factors as they go. So it takes a lot of different looks. You can't just do it by indicators of compromise alone or IOCs. It's not just an IP address attacking you or an email attacking you or something like this. This is several actions or lack of actions that show this type of activity.
Yeah, fascinating. So going back to traditional employees, not everybody that makes a mistake downloads a file to their personal laptop, sends it, is got ill intentions. Does this help with, training, individuals? How, what courses should I give employees to be aware of these? Or maybe an individual needs to have a talk, they didn't have malicious intent. So do you see this helping increase or enhance the security posture of organizations?
Yeah, you bring up a great point there, is because typically when you have built an insider risk program at your organization, you bring in the proper elements. But recruiting and talent acquisition has not been one of those elements that is really been brought into the insider risk or the insider threat. They've been on the outside. HR is usually involved because, well, there's terminations and there's other things that have to happen, corrective actions. So they haven't always been as engaged. Well, when we have gone out on this evangelism campaign to make the community aware, we've been saying your human resources department needs to be in our briefing. When we brief people on the DPRK IT worker threat, we insist, hey, bring your HR person. Or after you hear this, we'll brief again and we'll brief HR, because HR and recruiting need to hear this. They're the first line of defense when it comes in there. The other thing is the interviewing managers, right? The interviewing manager needs to know the techniques that they're doing to bypass this kind of thing, and it's very you'd think that this is very basic, but it gets neglected because of the urge to hire the right talent. Because on resumes, these people are incredibly talented because they've used ChatGPT or Gemini or pick your AI bot assistant to build it, but they put down whatever they need on that resume to get hired. And then if they get hired once, well, that thing is copied to the next false identity and the next false identity, and they pass it around so that they can continue to get hired based on that resume. Then they're coached. They have a very well laid out training program amongst themselves to make sure to teach themselves how to beat the organizations that are hiring them. And so any technique that works, they share. So cameras on, that's one of the easiest way. Or what we're really encouraging is if this is any type of a sensitive position at all, you really should have somebody from your organization meet them in person. Find some way, meet them, make sure they are who they say they are, validate it. Just say it's part of the process. I know if I'm hiring somebody that is going to put in something that is part of my intellectual property or something that is my crown jewels, I'm going to make sure I know who that person is. And if I'm interviewing them, they're going to be on camera, and it shouldn't be with a false background or something like that. I need to see where they're at, and they verify who they are. And this happens to everybody. It even happened at DTEX. And we had a IT worker attempt to gain employment with us, but we recognized that in their resume they had what I would call an illegal technology, meaning like they claimed knowledge and expertise from a technology that hadn't even been invented yet when they said they were working with it.
Interesting.
So, yeah, that was a really big indicator.
So, as long as I've been in cyber and my company focusing on it, prepping for this are things I never considered or had discussions around. So, again, DTEX's expertise and focus, solely or laser focus on this is really amazing and insightful. So, back to North Korea and the interesting and how we're using that as example. How are they structured? They have a unit called, 227, and, I think you mentioned, in our conversation before starting, they actually act as a, crime syndicate, which is also interesting. So maybe a little bit elaborate for everybody and educate the audience on some of those kind of topics.
Yeah, we recently released a report outlining what we believed was the hierarchy or the organizational structure of the DPRK, and how every element was using IT workers to fund this, and how it formed. What we noticed quite quickly was we couldn't think of this like we had the Chinese threat or the Russian threat, the very well organized bureaucracies with a very rigid reporting structure. What we noticed quite rapidly is when your survival is based upon this, which it is for the North Koreans, and their ability to continue this, and the prestige it gives their families back home, and the treatment they get, the medical care they get, how much food they get. All of that depends on these individuals' success in this scam. So if you look at it like a criminal organization, more like mafia or organized crime, everybody works at some level, but they all feed that money up. So if you look at how that scam and fraud goes, you would have, like your corner boys working and peddling dope or drugs or whatever on the street corner, and then they have an individual that's coordinating all of those corners, right? And you just follow that type of scheme all the way up to the top, up to Kim Jong-un, and then you're working through that. You see that they each operate independently of one another with very light collaboration and sharing. However, like I mentioned, when the TTPs work, that word gets out and they start sharing that. Same thing, if somebody is cutting drugs with a certain thing and it's getting through and not killing people, well, everybody else is going to start doing that to continue that fraud. Well, the North Koreans are very clever, but they have these individual groups. Now, I mentioned, you mentioned 227. The research center 227 has gained some attention recently in national security reporting, where they are kind of the AI element and working on, they've gone kinetic with some of their techniques and capabilities, and it's showing up in the battlefields in Ukraine. So that type of wow, so their research and their capabilities, their what they're doing with AI, all feeds different groups. Well, the Research Center 227 has really expanded what we believe to be part of this. So, it doesn't operate like we are used to, that we're comfortable with China and Russia, and to some levels Iran. But DPRK is going out there and they're doing things that just are survival based, and that's really what is strikingly different about them compared to the others.
So I think one of the techniques we also talked about, which was interesting, their use of VDI, or virtual desktop infrastructure, to further confuse, fake out. So another thing to think about. So we'll talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, this was one of the things that when I joined DTEX about 7 months ago, this was one of the hot investigations that we were currently in the middle of. Is after a laptop farm takedown, what happens next? Because the North Koreans are watching. They're seeing what techniques, tactics, and procedures we're hip to and what we're able to detect. Well, we knew there'd be a shift. Well, what we found quite rapidly was they were shifting or more heavily utilizing virtual desktops. So, and this is the technique where, for remote workers, it's usually if you either send them a physical laptop asset, or you just give them their credentials to log into a particular website, which is actually your virtual desktop. So, and this is very common. Most companies do this. They have virtual desktops, and so it's not necessarily the only indicator of evil, of if there's anything VDI related going on. The North Koreans were then getting that access and getting great trust in that. And after they gained great trust in that, then they would commit the rest of their scam. But they always follow a playbook, and this is incredibly important for the listeners, is every time an IT worker lands on a network, they immediately try to expand their access by downloading every single remote access tool, video conference, web conference, anything they could have. So most companies, they're partial to one or two technologies. They might have Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, but that's their primary usage, maybe with a couple of one-offs here and there, maybe a WebEx. But they try to get them all on there, and then some other ones you've never heard of. So there's no reason for that to be on your technology, but they're putting them all down there. So that's a very quick indicator, a quick win, if you would say. If you're watching, if all this happens, I would look immediately and start investigating why that worker needed all that technology. I don't know about you, but in my first couple of weeks at work, I'm lucky to find the bathroom, the coffee machine, and to be able to know when, who I'm talking to and what, part of the organization they are. That's just the way it works in our real world. Even if you're virtual and you're working from your home, you're still trying to figure out who these humans are. So that you can do your job and build your social network. The IT worker does none of those things. They get on these virtual machines, and then they set up their foundation to commit their fraud, and then they'll do things like set up their crypto account. So they might use that VDI network or setup to be able to just download and install, to get their crypto set up to then send their pay packet through crypto overseas. So then it can go through an exchange and then be monetized over in North Korea. And you can see that also. If you're monitoring for it, you can see that they're doing crypto on the company's equipment. Well, when they get really comfortable, this is when you can really identify them, because sometimes they'll trust that VDI so much, and we think it's due to fatigue or maybe just a lack of operational security, OPSEC. They will then connect to another company with a similar ID that aren't related to each other at all. So they'll connect into one, start doing their work, and then from that company connect over to a completely unrelated company, using it as like a jump host or a bastion host, so that they can commit their fraud. And that causes us, when we see it at DTEX, then we've got another victim notification to do, because hey, we already know this is fraud, and now we're seeing this fraud at another location.
So everything we're talking about is sort of non-cyber or traditional cyber indicators, more behavioral. I think we have a couple graphics we're going to bring up on the podcast here to bring it to life and be able to visualize some things. So, Rob, if you would, go through those. I think we have 3 graphics. Would be great.
Yeah, so what we'll start first with is the correlation of technical and non-technical indicators. And this is how we build those behavioral profiles to show that you can't just look at these other indicators in isolation, because that won't tip you to what the IT worker is doing. So, walking through that, there's the pre-employment technical indicators, which is using any of our known IT worker email accounts that we have shared on our website, so that people can get an idea of, hey, if they're reusing some of these stolen accounts or facilitator accounts for this, you can then identify and go to that quicker. So that you know what's going on. Their language or their communication, avoidance and anomalies. They do speak English, but some are not very good to the level where you can understand them, so they avoid doing it at all costs. Sometimes you'll see on camera, if you're watching them, that the voice doesn't match up with the mouth. And I'll go into some stories later that the listeners will probably think are pretty funny. And then you add in, like I mentioned, what happens after they get hired with downloading all that remote software, anything there you can do to keep their connection alive or to be able to share that out, because they will often reach out to their peers across these, in their room to say, like, hey, I need some help on this project. So, multiple connections through the same identity. Those are, more of your traditional IOCs, but, they're doing it, and what it shows up as is kind of an impossible amount of workload. They're accomplishing so much that a normal person couldn't do. And that's and then the overemployment behavior that we have another chart of, where they are the normal worker throughout the day. So another visual for you is, what normal activity looks like in a week. So when we said, okay, so we've got these behavioral indicators, and when we stack them up, we know that this is not looking good. Well, now, what does a normal employee look like if you were able to chart like their mouse movements, what time they sign in, do they take a lunch break, et cetera? So we found that, and it looked exactly as we expected it to. Most employees showing up sometime between 7 and 9 in, their workday, working throughout the day, throughout the morning, high level of work activity, and then, a lunchtime drop-off. People are signing out, they're locking their workstations, they're being human beings. They go and do that. And then the ramp up after lunch, and then tailing off their work activity throughout the day. Well, when we took a known IT worker and compared that up against them, it was all over the charts. And in fact, their workday is truly unsustainable. There's only about 4 to 5 hours that they aren't working throughout the day. And then they also aren't working at peak time when most of the traditional correct workers would be working. And then there's this really crazy just drop off that is not lunchtime. Like, every IT worker drops off at this time. And I thought it was like, well, that's a PT session or something that they're doing. Well, I was corrected, and they said, actually, that's like devotion time to, to the main man, to Kim Jong-un. So they said, hey, they're actually doing devotion, retraining, the things that they're required to do to show their loyalty back to North Korea. Because if they don't do that, well, that's suspicious, and they won't, these are workers that won't ever speak ill of the supreme leader. So that drop off occurs, but then a huge ramp up right after that. Because why? Well, they're late, they're behind, they miss meetings, or they've got to get on meetings again. And so when we charted that against the workload of a normal U.S. worker, there was no way one person could do this. So they're clearly all surging at one time to get the work done on one particular effort. And then it does that very uneven workload scale, and only 5 hours off per day, right? That wouldn't fly in most countries, including the United States.
Yeah, I would think that's true for any worker that you could sort of look at anomalies and. Is there any other graphics or?
And well, that comes to the, what should we do about this? What do we do now? How do we detect this, or what needs to happen? And we've covered some of it throughout the conversation, but number one, we have published what we call an insider threat advisory, an ITA, on our website. You're free to go and get that, and it covers this particular fraud very deeply. We also have released some indicators of compromise or traditional IOCs out there, being some of the facilitator and IT worker emails, the ones that they're passing around, reusing, their stolen identities, fraudulent identities. When we dug into one of our very first investigations of this, we found the person that the username that was being used. We actually found a Facebook post historically where they said, hey, don't respond to my friend request. My account has been stolen. Most of us have had that happen to us. And, immediately that's where, the traditional fraud, they hit you up through Facebook Messenger or something like that. Well, I mean, it was exactly as you would expect to see. Okay, so this account has been compromised or is being replicated or used in some manner. So those are there for you. Grab them, download them, run them through your HR system, and that leads you to the next thing is, well, you better start talking to HR. HR needs to be brought into this situation, not just, don't tell them just about the naughty workers that are doing things that you're angry about or misbehaving or, violating your code of conduct. They also need to know about, hey, this worker is not showing up to work, or they're showing up at incredibly odd times and they never talk to anybody. Some companies would see that as maybe, a little bit of a mental health crisis, which is of concern as well. So if you're paying attention, those are people that maybe need you to reach out to them. They're not all IT workers. But in this case, what we're talking about today, we found that just talking with recruiting and HR is truly one of the most cost-effective ways to get in front of this, is to make them aware. And then if you have third-party contractors, you should start vetting them out. If you haven't already, you need to be looking at them to say, like, who am I really working with when I hire these people? What are their practices on trying to investigate and prevent IT workers? Because we have talked to some of these employment agencies, and they've started implementing practices based on our findings and what our protection suggestions are. And then, watch for any unauthorized access activity after they're joined. Plus, like I mentioned, the weird work hours, the downloading of all that software that they don't need. If that happens in the first couple of weeks, you should be really wondering what's going on, because usually you're providing them with a laptop or with enough software to get their jobs done. And then, of course, you can contact us. If you have something suspicious going on and you just want to say, like, hey, this is what we're seeing. Can you maybe identify that? That's a free offering right there on our website, to just jump in and say, like, hey, could you check to see if you know about this IT worker? And we can look for that.
If I could jump in there, so someone's watching this podcast and they have an insider threat program, it's not that robust, or they don't have one at all. How would DTEX help them above and beyond the amazing technology? Do you have advisory services that would come in, help them develop that program? You're more than just technology. How would you help an organization get going?
Yeah, when we start that conversation, we really try to find out where the organization is, on the spectrum of maturity for their insider risk management program. We'll meet them where they are. If they're just getting started, obviously we have some basics that we would cover with that, such as, have your mission, your scope. What is your charter that you want your insider risk program to do? And do you have the right elements in your company lined up so that you can execute on that program? We do. I'm the director of the services organization, and we actually we have the best behavioral analysts in the whole world. I really feel that we have wrapped up in this platform some of the greatest human beings that can conduct this work, and they care so much about protecting their customers. We're just very customer obsessed and very vigilant with making sure that they're safe. and we work inside figuring out what their risk tolerance is. Every company's risk is different. There's no way you can go from one company to the next and their risk level is the exact same. That's just not possible. In my earlier days in the FBI, when we'd be doing victim notification on any of these things, any type of bad activity, sometimes we would get a reaction of, we want to find this person, we want to prosecute them, all the way to, okay, thank you for your information, please never come back. Those were the the wide spectrum of responses. But we don't get that in insider risk at DTEX. We understand what people want to do with their program. Everybody wants to have a safe place to work, as well as having the security knowing that your work is going to be protected. You don't want to do all this work for it just to be stolen. That is demoralizing. If you put in years and years of effort of designing the next cool widget that's going to change the world, and it immediately gets stolen by the Chinese or any other nation state just looking to do harm, that you don't want to work for them. You want to make sure that that's actually going to go to some kind of good, or has to be fulfilling, right? So that's part of it, and then you also want to know what your metrics are. You want to know how you're going to say, is this program doing what it's supposed to? And then there's some pitfalls to avoid of, don't over collect, don't over surveil, this, because that gets too noisy. You're unable to actually find the evil through the noise if you're hoovering everything up and it won't work. We've figured that out for years, in using SIMS and the SOC daily alert list. If you've got too much noise, you can't find signal to noise, right? And and again, it's not one size fits all. And also, if you need to protect your what we call leavers, or people that are departing the company. Departing on good terms or whatever. Some people think, well, that's Jane from accounting. Jane will never cause us harm. She, we're going to give her a cake and a goodbye party, and it's going to be wonderful. We wish her well. Well, maybe Jane from accounting is going to take, the sales list with her, and all your prospects or things like that. You don't know. So you should be paying attention to leavers no matter what's going on with them. Or if you have maybe some reduction in force on the way in, you might want to step up surveillance of the organizations, or, just the monitoring to make sure that everybody in that group is behaving appropriately. Companies don't always do a great job of keeping secrets as to when this stuff is coming. So and if you're giving them a long notice as well, we've seen lots of cases where people will have many months, like 9 months, 12 months of notice that their job is going to be eliminated. Well, I don't know how hard they're actually working, and they may actually be up to a little more evil or grabbing information on their way out.
Yeah. So as we begin to wrap up, a lot of platforms have behavioral analytics. It's impressive that DTEX, again, laser focused on that problem. Not only the technology platform, but the people that have this expertise. Ex-FBI, as you mentioned, all sorts of disciplines that could help an organization. So, any parting thoughts for the audience, and then we'll wrap up and thank everybody for their attention.
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid of this problem, and also don't think you're alone. We have run across so many organizations that have this happening. I always request at the end of every presentation I give, including this one, is, just talk to people, talk to your peers. When you're at the conference, tell your best IT worker story, because there's some pretty wild interviews that have occurred, and I'll share one right at the end of this, just to kind of say, what they will do to
why don't you give us that story now?
So I always have story time. So I've had some reports of individuals. Like I mentioned, our individual that applied for us didn't do anything too crazy, but had, we could see through the headset that he was wearing in the background that he was not where he said he was in a very crowded room conducting this interview. Well, that was kind of like an IT worker hub is where he was. One of the more kind of humorous ones, during a second series interview, so, more of a technical interview, the individual was answering some of the questions that they knew were coming, and so they were doing okay, and the grammar was all right. Then as the interview proceeded and the individual started to struggle, they started to pretend that their microphone was going out. And you know, we'd already forced them. They had already forced them on camera, and as they pretended the microphone was going out, a different individual joined that call, and you started using audio. Whereas then the IT worker, the individual that was trying for employment, just started moving his mouth, you know, like a puppet. So it was a totally different voice that was going on. And then the last one, the story, they knew it was an IT worker all along, so they had been forcing the person, you know, into more aggressive type of activity. You know, you might remember the days of the 411 eaters where they'd make them post pictures of themselves online or whatever, and you know they'd dox them. Well, they said, oh, you know, well, we need you to come in, you know, to get your laptop. Oh, you know, I have a sick aunt. I need you to ship it to Arizona. Okay, well, we'll do that. You know, oh, well, you need to come in for your drug screening. Okay. So then they had to find somebody to conduct the drug screen for them. It was like, yeah, all right, well, today's the big onboarding day. We need you to come in. Oh, I can't come in. I've got COVID. Okay, well, we'll schedule this in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks comes around. All right, it's time to come in. I can't. I've been in a car accident. Oh, no. Well, can you go on camera? We just want to make sure you're okay. We have to, you know, we don't want our employees to be hurt. How can we help? So the person ran to the drugstore, got gauze, and then wrapped their head in gauze to go on camera like they had a head injury, you know, the full, you know, go to court with a neck brace on and a crutch, you know, kind of scam. And I mean, they try everything to get it. But those two stories make me laugh pretty hard, thinking that they'll try anything.
And it's going on every day around the world. So
yeah.
I think we're at the concluding time of our podcast today. I'd like to thank Rob, DTEX, of course, Karasoff for supporting their partner community and offering this podcast studio. Please reach out to Scoop Cyber. You'll see the email addresses on a slide coming up, as well as Rob directly. We're here to help. We're here to educate and make the world a safer place from insider threat. So thanks, everybody, for the time. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.